You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with author and journalist Rachel Shabby and Daily Mail columnist Sarah Vine. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, the front of the Metro says some ambulance workers abandoned their strike to dash to 999 emergencies. The Eye predicts that turmoil in the NHS will last days, with bigger strikes to come in the new year. The Mirror accuses the government of a deadly silence and says they won't talk pay to anyone. The front of the Telegraph says the NHS will be offered a new pay deal to end their strikes. The Express says the number of 999 calls plummeted during today's strikes amid fears people were suffering at home. The Guardian warns the health service may become overloaded with a surge of patients after days of strikes. The FT says US tech giants are ditching offices in London and Dublin as years of rapid expansion are brought to a halt. Hit cop drama Line of Duty is returning to TV screens. That's on the front of The Sun. The Mail says driving home for Christmas is going to be a bit of a chore, but we don't have the front of the Mail for you. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Rachel Shabby and Sarah Vine. There you both. I thought one of you had deserted us, but you're both there. Good to see you. Let's start with The Guardian, and they're suggesting that the NHS is braced for a surge in patients because a lot of people took advice not to call in to the ambulance service and dial 999 and stayed at home and suffered at home, but the repercussions of those will knock on into the days to come. Rachel.
Yeah, that's right. So The Guardian is reporting exactly as you say, people did stay at home and heed that warning to stay at home during this day when the ambulance workers were out on strike for the first time in 30 years. And so now in the days up to Christmas, when, you know, staff is streamlined anyway in those days, there's the fear that there will be an extra load on the NHS as people who essentially delayed seeking care will now be doing so. That The Guardian notes that this will be quite similar to, you know, what happened during COVID-19, during the lockdowns, when people basically have avoided seeking care, and then the NHS dealt with this huge backlog. So it won't be the same scale, but it's the similar kind of pattern. Now, obviously, with, you know, both the nurses out for the strike for the first time in their history and the ambulance workers as well. You know, the trouble for the government here is that they both do have widespread support. People know why they're on strike. People understand why they're on strike, and 2/3 of the population support them, which makes the government's refusal to even go to the negotiating table over such a critical issue and such important and valued workers. It just makes them look belligerent and obstructive.
Yes, and the Guardian's reporting that a hangover from the ambulance strike is that the wards will be fuller over Christmas, and that's just the time when actually they operate on a skeleton staff, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of maybe some people who didn't call an ambulance today won't need it, because if they are, you know, genuine emergencies, they might find that that emergency has gone away. But yes, I mean, there is. I mean, it's always difficult over Christmas because, as you say, there are fewer staff generally, and people tend to wind down. But, you know, also over Christmas, people tend to drink rather a lot and fall over and do things that perhaps they wouldn't normally do. So it is difficult. I don't know if I do think quite a lot of people support these strikes, but I'm not sure that when it comes down to it, if you're the person who can't get an ambulance, if you're having, if you've got something wrong with you or having a stroke or your child is sick, whether that will translate into continued support. So it's very difficult for these strikers, because they have to find a balance between, pursuing what they want, which is a pay rise, and not fundamentally going against their vocation, which is to help people.
And keeping public on side as well. It's the politics of it all. And the Mirror, they quote, they won't talk pay to ambulance crews, they won't talk pay to hospital porters, they won't talk to nurses, they won't talk pay to anyone. They're accusing the government of a deadly silence, Rachel.
Yeah, and it's interesting what Sarah says about, you know, the calibration over public support and the politics of it all. I mean, I think the trouble for the government is that its own popularity is pretty low. You know, it's polling around 25%. And what the polling is showing with all of these strikes, actually to varying degrees, but overwhelmingly with NHS workers, is that if people are inconvenienced, which of course they are. I mean, strikes by definition, they're supposed to be inconvenient. They aren't blaming the people who are on strike. They are blaming the government or, you know, in the case of, say, railways, the companies running those railway lines. And so that's going to be a huge problem for the government, that message has been understood by the public. And we've all heard the nurses and the ambulance workers. We all know and understand that they are doing it actually to protect the healthcare service, which they say at current staffing levels and their current experience of it is endangered. It's a danger to patients and they worry about patient safety. Now, of course, we all are worried about this. We all have loved ones who are vulnerable and worry about what might happen to them. But I do think that it's interesting that overwhelmingly there is this public understanding that is not the fault of the nurses and the ambulance workers. The blame for that lies squarely with the government.
Well, the Unite Union is saying that the government could have ended the strikes but chose not to. That's a direct quote. Just finally, we've just got time to have a look at the Eye, Sarah, and they're predicting that there'll be bigger strikes in the new year.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that they're not going to back down. I mean, they are asking for 19%, which is a lot. And I think that is unreasonable, to be perfectly honest. They've rejected in Scotland.
They have asked to negotiate. They have asked for talks. So one would presume
yes,
that they're happy to negotiate down from that. That's a starting position.
Yes, but so far that hasn't happened. I mean, Scotland, they've rejected 7.5%. I think that was on the table here as well. I think probably they'll have to settle somewhere around 10%. But it's clear that the government want to an extent, control the agenda on this. They don't want to seem like they are being bossed around by the unions, because that would be an admission of failure for them and for their constituency. So it really is a Mexican standoff here, because the government can't really, if they start to give in to what they would term, blackmail, then they will not have, they will lose whatever core support for them still remains. So it's very difficult. I think that at the end of the day, yes, you're right. People do support nurses and ambulance drivers probably more, I suspect, than they support rail workers, who tend to get paid a lot more anyway. So I think that any conversation around the NHS is hugely emotive, and understandably so, because it's something that we all feel quite connected to.
Rachel Shabby and Sarah Vine, and that is what we are going to talk about. The Daily Express, they're saying that he's had a hero's welcome, and that promise of Patriot missiles for Zelensky. Sarah.
Well, he's very. I mean, he's a brilliant man, actually. I mean, he's very intent on making sure that support for his country doesn't sort of fall off the front pages. I mean, and that's I don't think I've ever seen anyone with quite such a talent for making sure that his cause is top of the news agenda, and that's what's going to save him, because of course, so many of these conflicts happen. I mean, not necessarily as big as this one, but there are many conflicts going on around the world, and they do fall off the front pages. But with Zelensky as a figurehead, that's just not ever going to happen. And I think his efforts are heroic. I mean, he's a very inspirational figure, and it's interesting because his story is just so bizarre in so many ways, because he was a sort of entertainer, and now he's become this great general. Extraordinary.
Yes, and he's pictured on the front page walking with President Biden at the front page of the Financial Times at the White House. This is the 300th day of the war in Ukraine, and at a moment when we know that President Putin has stepped up the assault against Ukraine, attacking the infrastructure. In his speech to the White House, he ended by saying glory to Ukraine, and that has to be the wish of the international world, Sarah, certainly of Joe Biden, and he made that clear this evening. Sorry, Rachel.
Well, definitely.
I was trying to bring Rachel in there. Sorry, Rachel.
Sure, absolutely, and it's interesting when we hear that this is his first trip outside of Ukraine since the start of the war 10 months ago, 300 days, an awfully long time. And just, to think about that length of time that Ukrainians have been dealing with this horrendous military invasion from Russia. But of course, you're right that, Zelensky will be wanting to maintain a sense of support and get those assurances from the US and the Western world and NATO, which so far have been forthcoming. I think it's been something like $65 billion of US military and non-military aid since the start of the war. And also this sort of assumption that Zelensky would be able to, and Ukraine would be able to determine the terms of the eventual negotiation that will end the war sooner rather than later. But of course, that's always a calibration. And,
Indeed.
I think the Russian propaganda
Rachel,
has very much...
Sorry to cut you, but we've run out of time.